Welcome back, everyone. This session is called The Challenges of Teaching and Exhibiting. I have been told by Leo that my job is to be the official timekeeper, which means we're going to try to keep to schedule 20 minutes, folks. A little more if we have to, right? Which is, whether secular or religious, it's called Jewish time. Our first speaker, and I'm not going to do all of the titles because everybody knows everyone's titles, and I want the speakers to have the time and not me. Our first speaker is Katrin Kogman-Appel and Ronit Steinberg, who are going to be speaking on the visual arts in Jewish societies. Correct? Fantastic. So you're on.
Good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, thanks to the entire Bar-Ilan staff for getting us all together here at the end of the summer. It's really, I realized that this was a challenge to organize this all, and I think everybody's so really grateful to Ilya and Lior and Sarah and Miriam and whoever was involved in this. We wrote this paper together, Ronit and myself. It's about our experience writing a course book for the Open University of Israel, and for various family-related health challenges, we did not make it to rehearse together. So for that reason, I'm going to read it. Ronit will deal with the PPT, but we really wrote it together in kind of a ping-pong method, back and forth. So it's both, however. Okay, so here we go. Now you can time me. The visual arts in Jewish societies is the title of a course book project we submitted some years ago to the Open University of Israel. The course was commissioned as part of the Expanding the History of Art department led by Mati Meir. Chaya Friedberg was the partner during the preliminary stage of drafting the proposal. We are currently in the course of writing the course book, and we actually have finished about 50%. Our concept follows a compromise between the traditional chronological method of survey teaching and a thematic approach often favored in art history teaching in recent decades. During the following minutes, we would first like to touch upon the dilemmas that survey courses confront us with. We shall then discuss our rationale both from a more general point of view as it concerns the historical sciences and from a more specific pedagogical angle. We shall then briefly outline our concept and conclude with sharing some dilemmas about the desirable degree of integration of our individual contributions, which obviously are of a different nature. So how do we organize a survey course in the humanities? Any survey course in any of the historical sciences? At first sight, this seems to be obvious. Set a time frame, start at the beginning and get to an end. You have 26 sessions, organize those sessions along the common methods of periodization. Here comes the first problem. How does one in fact determine a time frame? Our course is supposed to cover everything from antiquity to here and now. It is supposed to consist of 10 units. So sure enough, we will be able to dissect the subject into 10 chronologically arranged periods of time. A few months ago, one of the key figures of the French Annales school, Jacques Le Goff, passed away. Faut-il vraiment découper l'histoire en tranches? He asked shortly, quite provocatively, shortly before his passing. Do we really need to cut history into slices? Its English version is the title of a posthumously published book. Its English version, Must We Divide History into Periods, is somewhat less provocatively titled. He argues that the traditional starting point for the Middle Ages, 476, the fall of Rome, and 1492 as the final point, are artificial constructs. In the case of the Middle Ages, it was a construct that had been brought about by Petrarch, in some sense, who wished to uplift the notion of humanism and what later would be called the Renaissance. On the other hand, needless to say, and also Negev admits it, that the historical sciences cannot really be approached without periodization. Meaningful periodization are among the most essential tools of the historian. What then would be a meaningful periodization? One that avoids judgmental nomenclature of the Dark Middle Ages versus the Enlightened Renaissance, Eurocentric approaches, non-Eurocentric approaches, colonial stances, post-colonial. When these dilemmas first began to trouble art historians, both researchers and teachers, in the 80s and 90s, they thought to get out of it by simply referring to centuries. The art of the 9th century, the art of the 10th century would have been suitable titles in a survey published in the 1990s, and I've seen such books. For example, the 12th century was a particularly exciting one, until we realized that we need to invent the notion of the long 12th century and the long 14th century. We realized that what makes the 12th century really special did not start in 1100 and end in 1200 and so on. Anybody who deals with Jewish culture, finally, knows only all too well that Jewish history does not neatly fit into the periodization schemes of general history, and the Jewish Middle Ages happened to continue until 1670, at least when I was at the university, until the reign of Joseph II of Austria. The Talmudic period does not exactly run parallel with the Byzantine period, and the Gaonic period messes with the Islamic period and so on. Is there a Gothic Jewish art? Yes, we all know that there's one of the most beautiful synagogues built in the Gothic style in 13th century Prague. The contemporaneous synagogue of Ibn Shushan, on the other hand, built in Toledo, another Christian region of Europe where Gothic art was particularly fashionable at the time, does not fit into the label of Gothic art, as it sticks to an Islamic stylistic idiom. Hence, it makes no sense to speak about Gothic architecture, neither does it help much to speak of Jewish architecture in the 13th century. There is no end to this all, and we cannot say that we have solved the dilemmas posed by traditional periodization schemes or postmodern attempts to overcome them. In the case of synagogues, it seems to make most sense to speak of Jewish architecture and in fact other arts within a Christian context, and to discuss art created within an Islamic environment separately, even if both phenomena happen to occur at the same time in Iberia, for example. How about teaching then? Certainly for the sake of teaching, at least, periodization and chronological arrangement are a convenient scheme that puts order into students' thoughts. On the other hand, do we really want to squeeze their brains into artificial constructs? Should we really break up our survey into a medieval and a Renaissance section only to get them into great efforts to tell the students at the end that all this is Petrarch's fault? Moreover, since the 1980s and the 1990s, teachers have been increasingly made aware of the fact that chronological coverage of historical material is boring, dry, more easily forgotten than more meaningful, hence topical breakups of the material. Topical coverage became very fashionable until we all realized that most of the students, in fact, come to our courses without a neatly organized chronological framework onto which we could hook our meaningful and highly interesting topical discussions. The American Historical Association conducts periodical surveys among college and university teachers, asking them how they tend to organize their material. The main dilemma, explains the report of one such survey, is whether to cover course material chronologically or to organize sections thematically. It happens so that most teachers prefer to use a combination of chronological and thematic approaches. Purely thematic approaches are rare. Likewise, purely chronological approaches are not very common. In the US, they are more common for a European history service than for US history surveys, which teaches us that the closer the students are to a subject, the more easily it lends itself to topical treatment. All this applies to first-year survey courses, whereas in other courses, thematic or combined approaches are usually the preferred format. The same applies to art history. According to most curricula, chronologically organized survey courses are required for early semesters and are extremely concise, much more than what we received, those of us who were educated in the old school. And they leave room for other coursework, which is most often topical. For example, a course on Islamic art at the University of Wisconsin offers a loose chronological framework that stretches like a bow from the beginning to the end of the course. It begins with the formation period and reaches the modern period by the end of the semester. However, the subjects of the sessions have regional, political, and cultural foci, or they stress certain media. A course in Roman art and archaeology stretches from the Etruscan to the imperial period, but within the section Etruscan, for example, it organizes the material topically as tomb art or sanctuaries and so on. Our visual arts in Jewish societies, which ideally is aimed at students with some experience in art history, largely follows such an approach. At first sight, its build-up is purely thematical. It consists of three main clusters. First, cultural interactions. Second, religious institutions. And third, the visual languages of Jewish art. Whereas the first cluster, cultural interaction, is largely organized along the timeline, this approach is less rigid in the other two. The first cluster examines how Jewish culture interacts with the cultures of the environment. This concerns the political status of the land of Israel in the ancient Near East, as much as the circumstances of the Jewish people as a minority culture in Europe and the Middle East during the medieval and modern period. The cluster encompasses Israelite culture within the context of ancient paganism, Jewish art within Islamic and Christian environments, and within each such section the narrative develops chronologically. So it's kind of the other way around than the examples I just mentioned from the US. Well, it's the same principle. The same applies to the cluster religious institutions. One section deals with the art and architecture of synagogues, another with ritual objects, and yet another with pictorial renderings and references of Jewish customs, of Jewish ritual law and custom. The last cluster is the most eclectic, and in the hope that by then the students will have acquired a basic sense of an art historical timeline, does almost not at all commit itself to a chronological framework. Many sections of the cluster focus on issues of identity. How do pictorial narratives, inspired from Christian art, function within a Jewish social context? How are these narratives translated into an idiom relevant to Jewish audiences? How does Jewish art approach religious polemics? What are the central symbols of the Jewish visual language? And obviously I'm not going here into any of the big discussions how we should define Jewish art. This is a whole different issue. Another group of questions that preoccupied us throughout the process of preparing the course concerns the pedagogical strategy. Studies of teaching methods in higher education repeatedly address the requirement to change teaching strategies. They define our period in terms of an information society, where knowledge is available and accessible. No longer need to define the body of knowledge is spread out, faces an almost unlimited range of directions, but it is also dynamic and constantly given to changes. Those concerned with academic teaching methods currently experience an intense process of adapting to these changes. Here we would like to touch upon our own efforts to confront these issues from three different angles: the authors, the students, and the universities. As to the authors, us. Given the course's extremely broad historical scope, we divided the writing along our fields of expertise: medieval, early modern, early modern to now and here. However, that would be Ronit's expertise. However, only a few units are offered individually. Mostly we try to integrate the material, our individual areas of knowledge and our approaches to it. Soon it became evident, as expected, that each of us writes in a different style and applies different emphasis. This first caused a dilemma whether to give up our personal ways of writing in favor of more homogeneity and unity, at the expense of rather artificial constraints and adjustments. As we both strongly believe that allowing individual ways of presenting knowledge, especially in the humanities, would not only be more democratic, but also beneficial from a pedagogical point of view, it was our decision to keep our individual writing styles and teaching approaches. Teaching in the humanities towards critical thinking is all about varieties of approaches, and hence we believe that the parallel presence of two different voices, so to speak, suits well our pedagogical approach, which seeks to expose the students to thinking strategies alongside the mere transfer of knowledge. This approach is known as the integration approach, and it was presented in 1994 by Swartz and Parks. The integration approach is based on the comprehension that activating thinking strategies does not take place in a vacuum, but requires preliminary knowledge and understanding of the field of knowledge. Therefore, this approach argues it is necessary to pass the knowledge to the students as it is combined with awareness of thought and research strategies. Accordingly, we perceive the parallel presence of our two voices in the course book as a positive factor, allowing the students to recognize two research approaches, two teaching approaches, and two forms of writing about art, as well as gaining the control on their process of knowledge acquisition, which they experience by reading the course book. Another question that we are confronted with is that of a specific target group of students. As already noted, the course is aimed at college students who have already taken basic coursework in the history of art. On top of that, and following the integration approach, we approach the students as a thinking human being and as a personality who can actively and critically apply a variety of thinking strategies towards our text. First, we trust the students to notice the changing form of writing and to be able to differentiate between both research approaches. They can draw their own conclusions as to how they serve their points of interest best. Moreover, we also trust the students' ability to move back and forth in the text and create internal cross-sectional linkages, such as between geographical eras, historic periods, artistic genres, or religious contexts. Given that today's students are familiar with spatial perception through the internet, we allow ourselves to grant them this significant role in the learning process. Knowledge acquisition via the internet implies switching from one link to another, and this has become part of the current mindset, especially, of course, in the younger generation. Accordingly, we expect them to be qualified to move back and forth also in the printed book. The third and last angle concerns the Open University as the commissioner of the course book. Its specific nature enables us to further adjust to the current knowledge society. The question we deal with refers to the dynamics of knowledge and its constant change. How should a text be written so that it can remain relevant for, say, more than 5 years? Following the work method common at Open University, we shall also prepare a booklet with guidelines for teachers and students. This booklet will include references to a variety of sources where additional knowledge will be gained continuously, such as archives and museums, as well as relevant websites and databases. In addition, we can direct them to tangential areas of knowledge, parallel research literature, and new academic materials. This way, the course can be updated continuously and will expand on the basis of the initial corpus of knowledge presented in the book. To wrap this up, Writing up a course book in Jewish visual culture confronts us with specific challenges. First of all, there's the specific challenge of writing the history of a minority's culture, embedded as it is in the culture of the surroundings. In some ways, this is similar to writing the history of the Jews, which should be, even though this is not always achieved, in constant dialogue with the history of the environment, in terms of the historiography, of course. In many ways, however, it's different. Whereas the politics of the environment dictate the history of the Jewish communities, cultural history does not act the same way. It does not dictate the course Jewish culture, especially visual culture, took. It evolves in a constant dialogue determined by the dynamics of acculturation and social and cultural exchange. In practical terms, this means that giving up the chronological approach creates an extra challenge. We are hopeful to have solved that challenge by choosing the cluster structure, having each cluster follow a clear chronology. By that we hope still to be able to meet the expectation of thematic organization that to our taste suits better the requirements of survey teaching. The challenging of co-authoring, finally, has not necessarily to do specifically with Jewish art. It is a challenge that can be met easily by open-mindedness and pluralism, two values that we believe teachers and students should share for the benefit of education in the humanities. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Yes. Susan.
Could this course be taught to someone who doesn't know art history?
Excuse me?
Could you teach this course to someone who hasn't done an intro to art history?
Well, yes. I mean, we touch upon that. I mean, I think it's structured that way that an intelligent and curious person would just supplement whatever he or she needs from other sources. I mean, we do not offer any, we do not define Gothic art, or we do not say, this and that. So we certainly expect knowledge but we create a time frame that makes it possible to get yourself organized. So, I mean, officially it's a course that could also be taken by first year students. We had a discussion about this with the Open University, and this of course has to do with how many credits they get in every year. But it would be better to have it after a general survey course, yes.
My question is about how did you overcome the challenge to incorporating modern periods and modern art into the scheme that you built?
It was easy. For me, it was easy. I read, usually we work together, so we talk about the ideas and then we decided which one of some of the ideas will be the main issue of this chapter, and then, I don't know, it was very easy for me to understand what I need to do, and
What do you mean by ideas?
Yes. Topics, yes.
Also the idea about, I mean, also how the structure of each unit or each chapter should, I mean, we always decide on the structure first. I mean, for example, now we are working on the synagogue unit, so we started to build a chronological frame, and then we said, okay, how should we go about this? And we should really start like 3rd century and up to 20th.
Synagogue is
or,
easy.
yeah.
What do you do with paintings and sculptures?
So we have narrative, we have thematic clusters, and so I start out with narratives in the medieval period, and then
First we have one unit that it's after art after the emancipation. That's from the first chapter of the book, cluster of the book, and then some artists and subjects that are not going to be there, of course. We are going to do them about them in the narrative, or about a Jewish woman is one of the subjects, so it will be there.
Because I feel that, you're talking about different parameters. I mean, what you describe fits very well up to emancipation. Afterwards, it's very hard to talk about Jewish societies. What would you say is Jewish societies in pluralism after emancipation period? What are you talking about exactly? The other thing that doesn't really fit in what you said is the not being dependent of like you gave the history example, right? Where history is very much dependent on what's imposed on Jewish history, while culture, life, or the Jewish culture or visual culture has much of its own independence. Could you say this also about the modern period?
So I work in the modern period, I talk about artists mostly, and find out a connection between subjects, not talking about the
So
community.
that means if we go back to iconography,
Yes.
okay, so basically you follow the iconography system that we all, grew out from the central Jewish art, where modern art is included into Jewish traditional art based on the iconography. That's
We
what the
define,
topic, what's the topic does.
no, we define, we basically find these basic issues in the first cluster.
Yes.
When we talk about the interaction with the environment, with the non-Jewish environment. And there, all these issues about how this functions in a post-emancipation environment in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. So these things are and there they are defined chronologically. And this first cluster is basically it's divided into the environments, but it's also the narrative is chronological.
I don't need chronology, I'm fine with chronology. But the problem is, that what you said, the artist, you cannot avoid the artist's story in order to understand, right? I mean, you can go from one topic to the other, but then you're choosing actually iconography approach. If you take, give me an example of topics that you were working with.
Yes.
And the other thing is the Jewish societies. Whom are you talking about?
Well, we have this different definition of actually, our take is, our definition is very broad. It's visual language that was made by Jews, for Jews, consumed by Jews.
But modern art is not made for Jews.
Yeah, either, not and. Either or, not and. No, not at all. I mean, it's not it really depends on a certain context.
Yes.
What definition works better. And we leave that open. We don't make any such commitment. But we can talk about it over lunch. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Felicitas Heimann Jelinek from Vienna.
Yeah, I also want to thank the organizers for this kind invitation. So I'm dealing sometimes, not always, but sometimes with Judaica objects and always with exhibitions. And I want to bring both of them together here and talk a bit about the problems of exhibiting Judaica objects. Judaica objects were at the core of Jewish museums founded in Europe in quick succession, starting in the late 19th century and in the first quarter of the 20th century. First of all, they served as repudiation of the supposed art version of the Jewish Volksgeist in the Hegelian sense, an allegation which was voiced both by Jews and non-Jews, as we have already heard. Secondly, they served self-finding and self-assertion. And thirdly, they served to satisfy an ethnographic thirst for knowledge. Judaica collections, respectively their remainders, were also at the core of those European Jewish museums that sprouted in the last quarter of the 20th century, though for entirely different reasons. Because now, after the murder or persecution of the majority of European Jewry, they serve primarily the illustration of Jewish religion and Jewish cult. Moreover, to put it somewhat harshly, the lack of Jews should be compensated by the wealth of Jewish objects. And what are Jewish objects? Judaica. Whoever lacked them would buy, the more expensive, the better. The market was booming. Museums fiercely outbid each other at auctions. The prices climbed to dizzying heights. Now, it seems, the time of reflection has come, of the realization that Judaica collections neither explain Judaism per se, nor are they able to substitute Jews. But this very positive process has its downside too. The core holdings of Jewish museums often become a source of pain. The pepped-up babies turn into neglected stepchildren. It is no longer possible to shine with Judaica collections. Have we thus reached an end with our Judaica collections and exhibitions? Or do we simply have to pose new questions to our collections, to ourselves in relation to these objects, to their messages, to their inherent possibilities? Questions that will prevent the collections from dwindling into decorative illustrations, and questions that will release the visitor from the obligation to rave about the 100th Hanukkah candelabrum. One way to ask this question or formulate this question could be, maybe, to deconstruct, construct, and reconstruct the Judaica object. And I want to give you two examples of two exhibitions with which I tried to do so. The first one was an exhibition at the Jewish Museum in Vienna a long, long time ago with a private Judaica collection, the Eisenberger collection. In one of our numerous conversations between the collector and me, he said in a very heavily Hungarian Yiddish accent, "Should I ever be born again, I want to be an Austrian." This longing became the title of the exhibition, I Want to be an Austrian, which you see here. The exhibition was designed by architect Martin Kohlbauer. There were no showcases, no pedestals. In fact, almost no material at all, except for the objects of the collection. They were placed right on the floor, simply put there, casually spread out. This was clearly a deconstruction of the Judaica objects. A barrier kept visitors at a necessary protective distance. Opera glasses, and you see them here, lying here. So magnifying opera glasses, help them to overcome the distance to the objects. After all, such dialectics always exists in exhibitions, to make something accessible to the visitors and at the same time to keep them at a distance. Usually this is done by bringing the objects to the visitor's closest possible proximity, that is, the showcase, on which they can flatten their noses, as it were. At the same time, full closeness is refused by by means of precisely the same showcase. This simultaneous keeping close and keeping away is so obvious and normal in the museum context that it even doesn't get discussed. With respect to the concrete circumstances of the Eisenberger exhibition, this obviousness was challenged on the one hand by the created distance, which the visitor had to perceive as anomalous and therefore with awareness, and on the other hand by the offer to overcome the distance by an act the visitor has to perform by himself, hence by a very conscious act. Thus, the observer was able to choose between the options either to look at the collection from the outside or else to dive into it by means of the opera glasses. The diving into the objects offered a further deconstruction. You could choose to look at only singularities, details, patterns you wanted to concentrate on, or you could choose to look at the whole. At the back wall, behind the objects, there was a large screen. You see it here on the right side. There was a large screen, maybe. Here, the collector faced the visitor and told him of his childhood. Let's see it here. I'm sorry. So this is the screen, and this is the beginning of the film. So the collector faced the visitor and told him of his childhood, his family, his collection, and what it means to him. He forced the visitor to also see him, to listen to him, to continue in thought his oftentimes meandering sentences while looking at the objects. Hereby, the object of the exhibition would indeed become the acting subject as well. This way, the presentation offered simultaneously to deconstruct a double possibility to construct. First, to construct the Judaica items as a specific individual Judaica collection, and secondly, as a personalized collection tied to the collector's world of memories, perceptions, and also projections. In some distance from the screen, here, and there you see Eisenberger talking about his objects. In some distance from the screen to the left, there was the only object that was not a classical Judaica object, but a painting. As is common in many large Judaica collections, the Eisenberger collection too includes a painting by Isidor Kaufmann. This is a full-face portrait of a young rabbi who wears a traditional shtreimel. As many of Kaufmann's Jewish portrait subjects, he looks demure without betraying any inner stirring. Between him and the exhibition, visitor, the collection was spread out, as you can see. He was meant to look at this collection the same way as the museum visitor, except from the opposite direction. He should be able to observe that which had been assiduously illustrated by us, the curators, meaning his own theme, his own topic. In a way, Kaufmann's rabbi too was meant to be allowed to ask questions. Maybe, why are objects that were of everyday use to me suddenly in the museum? Why are they no longer in use, or else why are they used in an entirely alienated manner? Why do visitors look at them? Do the observers believe they would learn what Judaism is all about by looking at a Judaica collection? The Kaufmann picture in the Eisenberger collection was intended to play a trick on the visitor and to upend the classic inquiry situation in the museum. Through the staging as a whole and the consciously made placement of the single picture, it was pointed out that the object was the subject. But by not functionally explaining the Judaica objects, but rather as part of a natural, both historical as well as contemporary Jewish habitat of a self-evident Jewish life world, they were deconstructed both as collection objects, but also as ceremonial objects. At the same time, the installation was meant to be a reconstruction, the reconstruction of the Judaica objects, being detached from their original function and given a new environment being recontextualized as a collection on which the collector could openly project his childhood memories and reconstruct it as ritual objects in relationship
Just a little on, but not enough on that people can't see, okay?
to the observant Kaufman Jew pondering about the viewer and his attitude to look at them.
Okay.
13 years later, the exhibition A Time for Everything, Rituals Against Forgetting, went one step further. It addressed the transition from one period to the next, that is, individual life events such as birthdays, childhood, school, majority, independence, age, marriage, as well as collectively marked ritualized passage, both in the religious as well as in the secular domain. Accordingly, the exhibition focused on selected Jewish rites of passage, on the specific implementation as well as their origin and meaning. All these rites addressed very universal in character. They were all linked to processes in which the actors are in part subjects and in part objects. The universalistic aspects of the selected rituals were based on the fact that humans need memory to assure themselves of their culture or also of their religion, their national identity, ultimately of their own selves. In a way that sounds, this exhibition sounds and seems pretty boring, if you hear it like that. I don't want to show here the individual Judaica objects I selected, but one I do want to show. This is this test. This is simply here to show that I have abstained in that exhibition from describing the course of celebration and holidays. Rather, based on the Judaica object, I have endeavored to address the fact that in their design vocabulary, many of the objects used in Jewish liturgy are not immediately accessible to the outsiders, since the depicted symbols are decipherable only in the context of Jewish memory. I wanted to show that they must be understood as visual imperatives so that the participants in the ritual will not forget the history of their relationship with their own culture. To achieve this goal, the objects had to be deconstructed first to make them understandable, to relink them to a Jewish context, and to reconnect them to the fundamentals it est the temple service. In the exhibition, it was a great concern of mine, and that again was a form of a deconstruction, that it should formally address the cyclical repetition of the rituals. That is, it should actually describe a circle. Describe a circle is factually not possible unless one has by any chance a Friedrich Kiesler building such as the Shrine of the Book available, but this exhibition took place at the Jewish Museum in Munich, which just has a rectangular floor area and whose space for temporary exhibitions even stretches over 2 floors. As you can see, the exhibition designer has met the impossible demand with the idea to create a semicircle from transparent fabric coverage on each level. If the visitor combined both levels in his mind, a circle would indeed emerge. Moreover, as many elements as possible were presented in circular display cases on round pedestals or in circle sectors. This means that we deconstructed the given space and constructed a space or several spaces we needed for the purpose on their own. Besides religious rituals against forgetting, circular rituals too were included in the exhibition. Today, a considerable part of these circular strategies against forgetting is the memory of the time of National Socialism and of the Shoah. Remembrance of the trauma is highly ritualized both on Jewish and non-Jewish side. November 9th to commemorate the November pogrom of 38, January 27th in commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau by the Red Army, the 27th of Nisan here in Israel in memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising have all become key dates in the collective culture of remembrance. Yet, the more ritualized the commemoration, whether on pertinent educational mass events in Auschwitz or during politically decreed national celebrations, the more doubtful seems the sustainability of this commemoration. The Austrian writer Heimann Jelinek has put it in that way, and I quote her, "Countless times we commemorate the victims of the Third Reich, and on tiptoes we then sneak away from them." End of quote. After all, how profound are these rituals that remind of the ultimate cruelty? How formulaic and lifeless are they in a present in which we manage to marginalize humanitarian catastrophes on an everyday basis? So I want to draw your attention to these photos here. But you see it now. Oh, I'm so sorry. The photo series you can see on the midnight blue wall across from the semicircle referred in a very specific form to these secular commemorative rituals. And they again supported the approach of deconstructing the Judaica objects shown just in order to make clear the relativity of the objects, their complete failure, if you want, and I mean aesthetic failure, ceremonial failure, as well as historic failure. Their overall failure in regards to the history and perception of their collective and individual function, use, and ethics. To link them back to the underlying topic, largely omitted, and you see this series here now better. So this is the war facing the objects. Largely omitted in public commemorative ceremonies is the victims group of the sexually exploited women in concentration camps. Several scientific studies on this subject notwithstanding, the specifically female dimension in the history of the Nazi system has been a taboo for a long time. The medium exhibition has attended to this problematic matter only hesitantly and very late. Therefore, the exhibition area remembering a taboo, which we can see in this photo gallery, was created. In her transdisciplinary work, the American artist Quentin Anna Wixrow has created a rite de passage of her own against forgetting by exploring through photographing over weeks and through her literary work the site of the no longer existing and even unmarked so-called Sonderbau in Dachau, that is, the concentration camp brothel. As little interest as there was in the post-war period in the history of the forced sex laborers, as little interest there was in maintaining these Sonderbauten physically. In Auschwitz, for example, the Sonderbau was redesignated as the museum archive. In Gusen, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp in Upper Austria, as a single family home. The Dachau brothel, probably opened in April 1944, was demolished completely in the 1960s. Hence, what you see here is that Wixrow took photographs of a non-place. Her works do not only deal with the topic of forced prostitution. The brothels established in the concentration camps as incentive and reward for peace work were only for Aryan prisoners. The women who had to work in these brothels were also Aryans. All those sites where Jewish women were sexually assaulted by the SS, the guards or fellow prisoners, are not tangible because they have been barely investigated. Sexual offenses committed by German soldiers in the occupied Soviet territories have only begun to be researched in recent years. Wixell's photos focus on the no longer existing brothel shack in Dachau, and thus on the obliteration of the history not only of the abused women, but also of the men consuming them. However, they also focus on the non-documented and the non-told stories of female and male Jewish suffering who were victims of sexual violence and inhumane humiliation in the Nazi system. A selection of her haunting photos and short text was contrasted with the, as it were, innocent strategies and objects against forgetting, and challenged the commemoration of this aspect of our history as well. They deconstructed classic, collectively used objects of Jewish ceremonial art, for many at the center of the exhibition, by means of an individual, contemporary Jewish art. They constructed, on the other hand, a collective feminist memory by the specific means of an individual Jewish artist, and they reconstructed Jewish rite de passage via Judaica objects as rituals that were at the same time historical and contemporary, abstract and real. And thank you.
We have 5 minutes for questions, please.
Yes, please.
Thank you for your lecture. I'm referring to the first exhibition of this private collection. I wanted to know whether you got any feedback from the public or from critics as to this whole business about reconstructing and reconstructing, and was there any attempt to show how these ceremonial objects were used?
No. I mean, this took place in the Jewish Museum, so I think one should not double the explanation of Judaica objects. It was already done. I mean, we just presented a collection of Judaica objects, and there are other floors in the museums which covered that. So. And as per, reactions is a very, very good question, and I think that, it's always questionable how if people understand all these things. That's very, very clear. Yeah, that's always the question. But on the other hand, I trust that first of all, the way of curating an exhibition in a different way, opens people's eyes. They don't have to understand everything the curator does, but it should be at least, trigger the viewer to ask himself questions. If only, why is this presented on the floor, or something like that? Yeah, why do we have the opera glass, etc. So I trust somehow in the fantasy of the visitors. And on the other hand, you always have the opportunity to take a guided tour and then you get to explain everything, so more or less.
I just comment, I found it very strong, the positioning of Kaufman's rabbi opposite of the viewer, and they're both looking at the artist being on the floor. So I found this very, very strong.
So, was there another question? Eva?
Just curious, because I think that in other collection exhibitions, Maxberg collection, so on, and I'm just curious, could you say a little bit more about the interest in collectors? I think there's some other ones. What's the name? The guy who collects anti-Semitica, so-called anti-Semitica? Sorry, I've lost the name now.
You mean?
No, it's also not.
It's also within that collection.
You mean the Schlaf collection?
Schlaf collection. Yeah. So I'm just curious to what degree people in Vienna, or you specifically are interested in the collector because he appears on the screen. Can you just say a little bit more about the collector and collection as an interest?
As an interest, I mean, collecting is part of a very aristocratic or at least highly bourgeois attitude to life in general, I would say. And but on the other hand, collecting or let's put it like that, and a lot of collectors I know really have to identify with their collection. I mean, for Max Berger, for example, who was a DP who stranded as a displaced person in Vienna coming from Galicia, for him it was clearly to reconstruct his childhood. He came from a very Orthodox family. He lost his whole family, and he wanted to reconstruct somehow the surrounding. Yeah, although they had never had this surrounding. I mean, there was no silver, and sure, yeah, it was very simple, but it was a way to recover something, to heal something. And I think that is a driving force, this aspect of collecting together the fragments, picking up the fragments in a way, yeah, and healing history, yeah. I think the generation of today of today's collectors is already different, yeah. If I think about Vienna, and I can't talk about American collectors, and I don't want to talk about Bill because he can do this much better than I can. But thinking about Viennese collectors today, I would say a driving force is now, because this is the second generation already, if not the third generation after the Shoah, they try to, or they tell themselves, they try to rescue, to bring back, it took so much time to understand how much, what a big amount of material heritage was lost, that it only began in the last years, I would say, this idea to be spread, okay, we should actually reconstruct this material cultural heritage and bring it back in a way to Vienna. So that would be my answer to that. And anti-Semitic collections are completely different, I would say, and I don't want to go into that.
Well, thank you so much.
He's a pro. He's a pro. He's a pro.
Our next speaker, our next paper is Andreina Contessa of the Nahon Museum of Italian Jewish Art, prepared together with Moshe Caine, who's reading the paper. Please.
It's my iPad. 1 second.
You can have it. Everybody's gonna hear all your typing. There were 7 people watching you live.
I can promise you it worked before. We're connected. It was working before.
No, it can't be here. It can't be here.
Okay. Just a bad connection. Not we're in. Okay. Okay. Listen, so well, Monty Python. Now for something completely different. I'll come back to this animation towards the end of my talk. Keep it in mind. But anyway, good afternoon. According to the conference program, even according to the title on the screen, I am meant to be Dr. Andreina Contessa of the Nahon Museum of Italian Jewish Art, which clearly I'm not. So those of you with a keen perception will notice that, or those of you who know her, know that I don't have her beautiful Italian accent. And she, on the other hand, doesn't have my beard, so why am I here? Who am I? And what am I doing here? Well, first and foremost, I'm here because more or less at this precise moment, if you look, Andreina is giving a talk in Mantova, in northern Italy. And she asked me to be here and represent her and speak in her place. And of course the question is, why me? So let me state categorically and for the record, I am not an art historian or an expert. I'm not even a museum curator. I head the Department of Photographic Communication and New Media at the Hadassah Academic College in Jerusalem. I have approximately 35 years of experience in imaging technologies, primarily in the field of documentation, conservation, restoration and presentation of cultural heritage, primarily Jewish cultural heritage. So I've worked for some 3 decades with museums, including over the past several years with the Nahon Museum, and it is more or less for that reason that I'm here to represent Andreina today and present her paper with maybe a few of my own insights regarding the role of the traditional Jewish museum in a time of changing practices, changing communication technologies, changing crowd expectations, and changing practices. So, from here, I remove my beard, put on my Italian accent, and I'm now Andreina. So anyway, if we imagine a Jewish museum today, we'll envision an institution with a commitment to thoroughness and depth in the exploration and exhibition of Jewish culture, history, memory, and life. The creation of the Jewish museums in Berlin and the most recent opening of the Museum of Polish Jews in Warsaw demonstrate how much the concept of Jewish museum has changed. But what about the classic Jewish museums? Those that cannot embark in the huge projects of creating new buildings and a new itinerary. Museums which possess a Judaica collection and show the Jewish diaspora ceremonial items. Are they still relevant to people in the 21st century? Are they using their collections creatively, engaging in dialogue and activity of today's cultures? And this follows on very well from the previous talk. These museums risk looking old-fashioned and not attractive to the contemporary public, though they are, as we just heard before, the very heirs of the first pioneer Jewish museums that opened in Europe over 120 years ago. In the late 19th century, the first Jewish museums began to present Jewish religion, history, and material culture to a secularizing Jewish bourgeoisie. At that time, a Jewish museum was mainly a repository of Jewish ceremonial art that reflected the inventory of a private collection and simply presented its contents. During the Second World War, museums in Europe, possibly with the exception of Prague, had part of their collections looted by the Nazis, and after the war, many objects, confiscated and unclaimed, were shipped outside of Europe, mainly to Israel and to the United States. After the Second World War, an urgent need arose to preserve the spiritual heritage of European Jewry, saving Jewish artwork in the diaspora, books and objects related to the synagogue liturgy and ritual. At that moment, to save meant bringing these articles and preserving them, usually in the state of Israel. As an example of this phenomenon stands the figure of Shlomo Umberto Nahon, who began his vigorous endeavors to rescue, to document the spiritual and artistic treasures of Italian Jewry by bringing to Israel Torah arks, abandoned throughout Italy, and infusing them with a new life and glory. First and foremost, as an example of things to come, was the task of shipping in its entirety the synagogue of the Jewish community of Conegliano Veneto to Jerusalem in 1951 for the use by the Italian Jewish community, already established in a building on Hillel Street, Rochot Hillel. This event was a formative step in the history of Jerusalem and the Jewish art housed within it, constituting a milestone in the annals of Jerusalem's Italian Jewish synagogue, which was fortunate enough to acquire the spectacularly beautiful 18th century synagogue furniture. I'll let this just run for 2 more seconds until we get back to there. So, in the 1950s, further valuable ritual articles discovered and rescued in the Jewish communities of Ferrara, Mantua, Padua, Milan and Rome were sent to Jerusalem. The shipment was officially labelled by those who recorded the inventory as, and I quote, a sign of Jewish national reinforcement in a place where Jews will never again be persecuted, and to guard against further acts of robbery. To understand the importance of Nahon's activities in bringing to Israel synagogue-related objets d'art, we must examine the cultural landscape of Israel during the 1950s, shortly after the establishment of the State of Israel. The Israel Museum, which would become a huge repository of Jewish diaspora art, had not yet been founded. Culturally, the Italian synagogue was outstanding in its unique beauty and its embodiment of an ancient tradition of art and culture. The museal landscape of this period was very different from that of today. The Bezalel National Museum consisted of a scant collection inasmuch as it was an appendage to the Bezalel School of Arts and Crafts founded by Professor Boris Schatz. The museum contained a collection of natural finds and local cultural artifacts, together with Jewish exhibits originating from the diaspora. Mordechai Narkis, mentioned today, director of the Bezalel Museum from 1932 to 1957, expanded the Judaica collection and saw to it that the museum evolved in this direction. This collection was incorporated into the Israel Museum with the latter's establishment in 1965. The germination of the museum concept in Israel developed alongside research and study of Jewish art. It should be remembered that the desire to preserve and study Jewish art within a museum context is a relatively new concept that began to develop in Europe simultaneously with the study of Jewish art and its recognition as a legitimate academic field of inquiry. Establishing Judaica museums in Israel was a complex process, given the national need to proceed from a theoretical utopian Zionism to a practical fulfillment of Jewish settlement in Palestine, owing to a debate, mentioned also today, as to whether the Jewish cultural baggage amassed in the diaspora had any place in the new Israel. The museums that began to arise in Israel were largely influenced by the European museum tradition. Their goal was to display images not only of Israel and its history, through archaeology, natural science, nature and technology, but also of Jewish culture and traditions beyond Israel's border. Over time, the image of museums in the world has evolved throughout history. According to the new museological approach, a museum should be defined by its socially, educational, relevant objectives and basic principles: collection conservation, research, exhibition, and museum education. Unfortunately, museums today suffer the influence of megatrends in society and the pressing challenges of audience and marketing. Expectations of museums are changing. Leisure time is at a premium. Consumers make choices based on perceived value and potential for excitement. In the last decade, the image of the Jewish museums has also changed. New tools, new theories, new methodologies for looking at museums and heritage have developed. Which models are currently being used in the field of Jewish museums? What innovations could Jewish museums implement to fulfill their vocation? What do the concepts of conservation, research, exhibition, and education mean at a time when the boundaries between the physical and the virtual space are blurring, merging, or even vanishing? What changes are needed to face the pressing challenges of audiences in our day? Raising these questions is a first step to redefining the mission of the Jewish Museum today. And of course, it's impossible for me to answer or to suggest answers to these questions in the confines of this paper. But I will say that Jewish museums are today first and foremost museums in the global sense, and as such, the purpose of museums over the past decade has undergone a paradigm change, from a repository of unique and precious artifacts to a commercial, educational, entertainment center, maybe. One may argue the wisdom of this shift, but one cannot escape the economic and social realities which have brought about the move. Most museums, especially the vast multitude of small museums, are bending under the economic burden. They have to reinvent themselves in order to survive, and as such, they must reach out to the general public rather than wait for the visitor to reach them. Publish or perish is being replaced by my own quote, www.ergo.sim. Sink or swim. Luckily, the digital revolution is proving an invaluable aid to this approach. Websites, virtual exhibitions, interactive activities, social websites, blogs, forums, and even crowdsourcing are all acting to reshape the modern museum. I would add here that during the first years of this digital revolution, much concern was raised as to whether the virtual museum would diminish visits to the real museum, whether visiting the website would replace the need to visit the museum itself. Well, statistics have proven beyond any doubt that this concern was unfounded. Nevertheless, they have also emphasized the need for the museum to reimagine its role. And in this respect, Jewish museums are no different. The visitor to a Jewish museum is not necessarily Jewish, and the young visitors are first and foremost universal youngsters, children, teenagers. That means that though they may be physically in the museum, as you can see, they are in all probability cognitively immersed in their phones and tablets. Therefore, rather than to try to combat this phenomenon, why not harness the potential of these powerful communication devices and use them to create an all-inclusive museum experience, one which starts before and in preparation to the physical visit, through websites and so on, continues with interactive and educational experiences within the museum, and concludes with post-visit activities through social networks, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and so on. I can't begin to outline in this paper the multitude of ways in which well-designed digital experiences can enhance the museum visit. These extend to multilingual and multi-age narratives, visual enhancements such as iBeacon technology, which some of you may be familiar with, hands-on alternatives, traditional do-not-touch approaches, quizzes, educational games, and the list goes on. Each museum must start a new vision process to rethink its mission, its concepts, and its narrative. Obviously, the reality has been stated here today of Jewish museums in Europe and the US possibly are very different from those of the museums here in Israel, and the visitors are obviously very different. But possibly the future is a working relationship in which the traditional collections become the stars and are used as teasers, as entry points for visitors, including those who may only participate online. Digital media are core to people's lives, so museums should use and have fluency in that environment too, from promotion and access to engagement. The ambitious project of the Israel Ministry of Culture to create a national museum portal, which has been recently realized after many years of work, takes a step in this direction. The first virtual thematic exhibition hosted by the portal and created by the Nahon Museum of Italian Jewish Art in Jerusalem, is a pioneer project that aims to bring the beauty and cultural significance of the museum to a worldwide audience by telling the story of the Jewish community of Mantua, one of the most important, creative, and flourishing in Europe. Navigating through the website, which I'm doing with our hands, the visitor may discover the story of the Jewish community of Mantua from the 11th to the 20th century. Virtually visit the town, discover its thriving Jewish life, visit its synagogues, hear the music composed by the Jewish Mantuan composer Salomone de Rossi. It includes bird's-eye views of the city's landscape, music, videos, cultural life, and 360-degree tours of the synagogues of Mantua. The narrative website, and I emphasize narrative, Mantua in Jerusalem, virtually gathers the treasures of the community of Mantua that are now dispersed all over the world. Historical documents, ritual objects, maps and books, bringing together resources from a multitude of different hosts, thus overcoming the limitations of location, transport, insurance and travel. And I emphasize here, this is not just a collection of the museum, but a thematic exhibition, which was again a subject which was raised before. It's a narrative, it's telling a story, and it's global. I mentioned earlier, take note of that animation of the Ark. The Mantua Ark, which, for those of you who know, is one of the oldest in the world, 1543, correct me, Casuto, if I'm wrong, was the starting point for this exhibition. And it was actually the reason for the exhibition, which I will come back to in a minute. There are items which can't be physically shipped abroad due to their size, their fragility, insurance costs, and so on and so forth. The Ark is obviously one of them. It is the centerpiece of the museum today. But to appreciate them truly, it is not enough just to represent them in a photograph. For this reason, it was decided that we were going to attempt something which hasn't been attempted in this country before, and that was to create a three-dimensional replica of the Ark. A 3D laser scan, for those of you who are familiar with the technology. This was an immense task, but it gives the viewer the ability to interactively contemplate the Ark itself and to explore it in different directions. And this digital surrogate really enables something which we haven't seen in the past. So let me conclude and say the following. I believe that Jewish museums in the future must engage with their visitors, both within the museum, with the physical spaces outside the museum, and with virtual worldwide audiences that they build around specific subjects, themes, and events. Furthermore, conversation and free-flowing dialogue between Jewish museums and the public are imperative to help fill the gaps in our stories. Without these conversations, museums risk the audience moving on to new and more enticing venues. Thank you very much. Questions, please. I can answer questions which I can answer.
You should not answer any others.
And I will not answer the others. Yes?
Yes, as a former teacher of Andreina and a very close friend to her, I can say that she told me just before leaving for Mantua that without you, nothing would have been possible. So we have to thank you.
Yeah.
First of all, I created this museum 35 years ago.
That's right.
And you are speaking of before and during and the future. this is, I believe, the only one community that has been unified in such a way, and it's wonderful, but it costs an enormous effort and a great lot of money. Enormous. You have to think that you have a great input of research, enormous input in lighting, in ventilation, in I have not to tell everything that has to be done. A small community cannot afford to do it. It's impossible. So if we want a museum like that for the Yemenites, for the Iraqis, for the Dutch, for everyone, and it has to be, because we are an enormous mosaic of museums that have to be done, but no one is thinking to do it. Every museum like that has to have a Michiganer that take on
You're the Michiganer.
I was Michigan, I am not anymore. But everyone, you have to see how to create this fantastic mosaic of the Judaism all around the world. Israel is a place, but I believe that someone has to take on himself in the government, in the Sokhnut, in the, I don't know, the task of creating such museum all over the country for all the great story of the people of Israel. It's not like Beit HaTfutzot. Beit HaTfutzot is something very, it's artificial. This is a real thing. And it is not existing. And it has to be done.
I agree with you. Wasn't the question, but I...
And not everyone has Moshe Caine. And that's also a point. You have done a lot of work, a very important work. But you cannot do it for 70 syllables.
I'm trying. Okay. Thank you. No more questions.